November 12, 1942, the Western Desert, North Africa. The war in the desert had turned cruel. Sandstorms shredded skin like sandpaper. Engines died in the heat. And among the ruins of a destroyed British supply column, one object sat abandoned, an American vehicle, captured but undamaged. To the German patrol who found it, it looked crude, square, small, primitive. A Jeep, the placard said. Willys MB. Their orders were simple. Destroy it. Leave nothing useful behind. But the officer in charge hesitated. Wait, he said. Get our best mechanic. I want to know if we can use this thing. 30 minutes later, a circle of Afrika Korps mechanics gathered around the vehicle. At first, they treated it like a curiosity, another piece of Allied junk. But as wrenches turned and hoods lifted, something strange began to happen. The laughter stopped. The joking died away. And in its place came silence, the kind of silence that falls when men realize they've just stumbled on something important. They didn't know it yet, but this little American vehicle, this Jeep, would change how they thought about engineering, war, and even their own country's future. It was not just a machine, it was a message. A quiet, rolling demonstration that the war would not be won by brilliance but by simplicity, scale, and speed. We thought it was crude, one German mechanic would later recall, until we realized it was perfect. The senior mechanic wiped sweat from his brow and leaned in under the hood. What he saw made him frown, not in confusion, but in disbelief. The engine bay was spotless. Every wire color-coded, every component labeled, every bolt, every part, perfectly placed for easy access. Was this designed for soldiers? He muttered. It was unlike any military vehicle he had ever seen. No maze of pipes, no precision-machined parts that demanded a factory's touch. Instead, the Jeep's little Go Devil engine was a marvel of clarity. 134 cubic inches, 60 horsepower, ordinary numbers, but extraordinary thinking. It wasn't meant to impress engineers. It was meant to stay alive in a war where dust, mud, and chaos ruled. German engines required perfection, special tools, trained hands, a clean workshop. A farm boy from Kansas could fix it with a wrench and a hammer. To the German mind, that bordered on heresy. But here it was, a machine built for ordinary men to keep running under extraordinary circumstances. Every Jeep was the same, every bolt interchangeable, every wire routed for clarity. The senior mechanic turned to his team. "This isn't built to be perfect," he said slowly. "It's built to be possible." They stared at him. In 2 decades of German military design, none had seen such deliberate simplicity. Even the tools it required were standard, the same wrench for the same bolts, everywhere. It was an alien philosophy, a vehicle engineered not for admiration, but for survival. And then the officer arrived, expecting good news. "Well, can we use it?" The mechanic hesitated, choosing his words. "This vehicle," he said, "is remarkable. It's designed by someone who understands soldiers, not engineers." The officer frowned. "German engineering is the finest in the world." The mechanic said nothing. He just pointed at the 4-wheel drive lever, one lever. "Sir," he said, "ours takes 3. In that moment, the pride of German craftsmanship met the cold efficiency of American pragmatism. And the mechanics knew, even if their officers didn't yet, that they were looking at something revolutionary. "Every part fits every other Jeep," the mechanic wrote in his report. "That is genius." The following morning, the German mechanics lined up their prize beside their own vehicle, a Volkswagen, Kübelwagen. It was a point of pride, designed by Ferdinand Porsche himself. Lighter, sleeker, air-cooled, and on paper a masterpiece of efficiency. Side by side, the two vehicles looked like they belonged to different centuries. The Kübelwagen, elegant, minimalist, proudly German. The Jeep, blunt, square, brutally utilitarian, but in war, looks lied. The Kübelwagen's engine, though beautifully designed, had an air-cooled vulnerability. It hated fine dust. The Jeep's radiator, though crude, could take a bullet and keep going. Its frame, overbuilt, heavier, almost clumsy, could withstand punishment that would twist the lighter German chassis apart. And then came the crucial test, the sand. Soft, shifting desert dunes that had stranded entire convoys. The Germans had always trusted their rear-wheel Kübelwagens. They were light enough to skim the surface, at least in theory. But theory didn't win wars. The Jeep engaged four-wheel drive with a single lever. Its tires dug deep, gripping the sand, pulling it forward like a mule with endless patience. The Kübelwagen bogged down, its rear wheels spinning helplessly. A corporal laughed nervously. "Too heavy," he said. The senior mechanic shook his head. "No," he replied quietly. "Too clever." What they were witnessing wasn't just a performance difference, it was a philosophy divide. German engineering obsessed over refinement. American engineering obsessed over function. The Kübelwagen used torsion bar suspension, elegant, yes, but difficult to repair. The Jeep used leaf springs, crude, cheap, easy to fix in minutes. The Kübelwagen needed precision tools. The Jeep needed muscle and a willing hand. Every American vehicle looked the same because sameness was power. A Kübelwagen needed an engineer, a Jeep needed only a soldier. By the end of the test, the German crew was silent. The Kübelwagen, though lighter by almost 900 pounds, had overheated and bogged down. The Jeep, heavier, stronger, dumber, had won. The senior mechanic jotted in his notes, "German design strives for perfection. American design strives for production. In this war, production wins." That note would echo across intelligence reports all the way to Berlin, and it would terrify the men who read it. Because for the first time, the Afrika Korps understood. They weren't losing to better machines, they were losing to a better idea. The following days turned into a quiet experiment. Every spare moment, the German mechanics pushed that Jeep to its limits. They drove it through the soft dunes where Kübelwagens struggled and spun. They overloaded it with men, fuel, and ammo. They drove it through wadis, over rocks, across terrain that would shatter axles. The little American machine absorbed everything. One afternoon, they filled the tank with poor quality fuel, the kind that would make a German carburetor choke. The Jeep didn't care. It coughed once, then kept running. The reports grew harder to ignore. "This vehicle demonstrates unmatched adaptability," one officer wrote. Another added, "It should not work this well, but it does." Within days, mechanics from other units came to see it for themselves. At first, they arrived smirking, arms crossed. By the time they left, they were silent heads, shaking in reluctant admiration. And in that silence came a realization that no one dared voice aloud. Maybe the Americans understood war better than we did. The Jeep wasn't about precision or prestige. It was about endurance, the ability to be beaten, abused, and still move forward. One supply officer, once proud of his factory training, studied it for hours. He finally muttered, "This is not a triumph of mechanics, it's a triumph of manufacturing." He was right, because beneath the hood of that simple Jeep was the real American secret, not genius, but system. Every Jeep identical, every part replaceable, every worker in every factory following the same plan, a philosophy so different from Germany's that it might as well have come from another planet. By late 1942, intelligence summaries from North Africa reached Berlin. They described not just captured equipment, but an industrial culture that valued speed over perfection, quantity over finesse, utility over pride. And slowly, German engineers began to understand what that meant. They weren't fighting an enemy that built better. They were fighting an enemy that produced faster. Factories, not generals, would decide this war, and Americans were already awake. By December 1942, the Jeep from the desert was no longer a curiosity. It had become evidence, a rolling report of American priorities. German intelligence officers ordered it disassembled, measured, and catalogued. Every detail, from the shape of its leaf springs to the thread pitch of its bolts, was recorded. The conclusion stunned the analysts. None of it was exceptional, and that, paradoxically, was its genius. Every component was good enough, not perfect, not optimized, not refined, but it worked. And when multiplied by hundreds of thousands, good enough became unstoppable. Inside German headquarters, industrial officers held tense briefings. Charts and graphs lined the walls, production ratios, logistics comparisons, resource curves, and at the top of every report, one brutal truth repeated itself. The Allies were outproducing them in everything. The numbers told the story better than propaganda ever could. In the same time it took Germany to produce 50,000 Kelvin Kübelwagens, America had rolled out over 640,000 Jeeps. Ford's Willow Run factory, the largest in the world, built a complete B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Each aircraft required 1.5 million parts, and yet the line never stopped. In comparison, German aircraft plants were still hand-fitting components, polishing surfaces, machining everything to near perfection. It was artistry, but artistry didn't win industrial wars. One intelligence colonel summed it up grimly. They build weapons to be used. We build them to be admired. Across the fronts, the same pattern emerged. Captured Shermans, trucks, even canteens all showed the same philosophy. Standardized, simplified, efficient, each part designed to be replaced, not worshipped. By early 1943, the German High Command commissioned a formal study, comparative analysis of Allied vehicle production capacity. The findings were devastating. The United States produced more military vehicles in 1 year than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined, and they were still accelerating. Meanwhile, German factories struggled under air raids, fuel shortages, and bureaucratic micromanagement. Every model had its own spare parts, every vehicle its own manual. Even replacement bolts had to be ordered from specific manufacturers. The report reached Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, who understood instantly what it meant. He later wrote, "The enemy's superiority did not lie in quality of equipment, but in the scale of its production. We could not match their output nor their speed of replacement." In the deserts of Tunisia, German officers could already see this truth playing out. Every destroyed truck, every broken half-track became a death sentence for mobility. Meanwhile, the Americans simply replaced theirs within days. What the Afrika Korps had witnessed in that little captured Jeep was the future of warfare, a future powered not by elite craftsmanship, but by the factory floor. The Jeep was more than a vehicle. It was a message from Detroit: we can build faster than you can destroy. May 1943. Tunisia had fallen. The Afrika Korps, once feared, was finished. 250,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms. Among them were the very mechanics who had once marveled at that captured Jeep. They expected humiliation. Instead, they got education. At Camp Hearne, Texas, captured mechanics found themselves surrounded by what they'd been fighting against: American abundance. Rows upon rows of vehicles stretched beyond sight. Jeeps, trucks, command cars, all clean, maintained, ready. More vehicles in one camp motor pool than entire German divisions had possessed in North Africa. When the American sergeant who ran the depot learned one of the prisoners was a mechanic, he smiled. "You're a mechanic, huh? Come on then, I'll show you how we do it here." It was not mockery. It was mentorship. The German followed the sergeant through the motor pool. Every jeep was serviced using the same tools, every part labeled, every step documented. Maintenance manuals written in plain English, with illustrations so simple a teenager could follow them. Color-coded wires, standard bolts, step-by-step guides that assumed nothing about the reader. "You see," the sergeant explained, "we design everything so any farm boy can fix it. Doesn't matter where he's from, he can read a few pages and get it done." The German mechanic nodded slowly, astonished. In the Wehrmacht, maintenance required special authorization. Here, anyone could repair a vehicle. "How many of these jeeps do you produce?" the German asked. The sergeant shrugged. "Thousands every week. Factories don't stop. Thousands every week." The number echoed in the German's mind like artillery fire. He realized what that meant, that America could lose a jeep in the morning and replace it by evening. That their vehicles weren't just machines, they were manifestations of a system built for infinity. The Germans began working in the motor pools, maintaining jeeps, trucks, and half-tracks. They learned how to strip an engine blindfolded, how to swap parts without special fittings, how to improvise with whatever was on hand, something unthinkable in the rigid Wehrmacht. At first, pride resisted the lesson, but necessity broke that pride, and slowly a new respect grew. What had started as defeat became revelation. They realized American mechanics didn't fear imperfection. They didn't worship machinery, they used it, and they kept it moving. By 1944, many of those same prisoners were running entire maintenance yards under American supervision. They were trusted, respected, and deeply changed. Because in that Texas sun, surrounded by abundance, they learned something that no victory could have taught them. Genius isn't in making things complicated, it's in making them work for everyone. Spring 1946, the war was over and Germany lay in ruins. Cities reduced to gravel and ghosts, factories silent, railways twisted like bones. But amid the rubble, something moved, an idea carried home by men who had once been enemies. One of them was a former Afrika Korps mechanic. He had spent 2 years in Camp Hearne, Texas, repairing jeeps for the U.S. Army. Now he stood in Bremen, surrounded by devastation, holding a ration book and a single suitcase. He looked around and saw American trucks hauling food, Willys Jeeps carrying officers through the ruins, and German civilians working beside Allied soldiers. When a U.S. motor pool officer asked if he could work, he replied simply, "Yes, I know these vehicles. I learned from your men." Within days, he was back where he belonged, under a hood, turning wrenches on American engines, this time for rebuilding, not war. And as he worked, he began teaching. To the young German apprentices who gathered around him, he spoke not of pride, but of purpose. He taught them the lessons he had learned in Texas: keep it simple, make it reliable, build it so anyone can fix it. He wasn't just repairing jeeps, he was translating a philosophy. By 1947, his motor pool was staffed mostly by Germans. They called him Der Lehrer, the teacher. His students would go on to work for newly revived companies, Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, BMW. Men who had once maintained the vehicles of war were now building the vehicles of peace. American aid, the Marshall Plan, poured in. But the real transformation came from a mental shift. German engineers, humbled by defeat, began adopting American methods: assembly lines, interchangeable parts, modular production. Volkswagen's factory in Wolfsburg reopened with U.S. oversight. The car it produced was small, simple, rugged, the Volkswagen Beetle. It carried the same DNA as the Jeep: minimal parts. Easy maintenance, mass manufacture. German precision met American pragmatism, and the result was rebirth. By the early 1950s, the economic miracle had begun. Mercedes adopted assembly line speed. BMW standardized components across its models. Volkswagen built hundreds of thousands of Beetles every year. The very principles that had once humbled Germany, standardization, simplification, manufacturability, now became the foundation of its recovery. In the words of one German engineer, "We lost the war, but in losing, we learned how to build the future." The Jeep had done its job even in peace. It had become a teacher of industry. By the time the war ended, even Germany's own generals admitted it. The Jeep had become a symbol of ingenuity, adaptability, and something far more dangerous than any tank. In post-war interviews, Wehrmacht officers told Allied historians that the Jeep, not the Sherman or the B-17, represented the true power of the United States. It wasn't because of its firepower. It wasn't even because of its mobility. It was because the Jeep embodied the system that defeated them, a system that could turn ideas into steel faster than any nation in history. General George C. Marshall himself once said, "The Jeep was America's greatest contribution to modern warfare." That was no exaggeration, because behind every Jeep stood the assembly line that built it, the ships that carried it, and the men who drove it without fear of breaking it, because if it broke, another would arrive tomorrow. To the Americans, the Jeep was just another tool. To the Germans, it was a revelation, a warning carved in iron. By 1944, the Wehrmacht's last hopes of catching up had vanished. Even Hitler's commandos, Skorziny's men, relied on captured Jeeps during Operation Greif. German troops disguised as Americans, using American vehicles, trying to sow confusion during the Ardennes offensive. It didn't work, but it showed just how far the Jeep's influence had spread. Even the enemy depended on it. And when Germany's tanks ran out of fuel, when convoys broke down for lack of spare parts, the contrast was brutal. The Allies rolled forward in convoys of Jeeps, trucks, and half-tracks, an army of mobility. Germany, once the land of engineering brilliance, had become a nation of horse carts and shortages. That's when the final, humbling realization set in. This war was not lost on the battlefield, it was lost in the factory. The Jeep was not just a vehicle, it was a philosophy on wheels. It represented a country that valued function over form, pragmatism over pride. A nation that understood the simplest machine, multiplied enough times, becomes invincible. And in the deserts, the forests, and the ruins of Europe, that philosophy rolled over everything in its path. "They built for production," one German officer said years later. "We built for perfection, and production won." Autumn, 1967. In a quiet museum in Bavaria, a small group of old men gathered around a familiar shape olive drab, square-edged, silent. A Willys MB Jeep. The men were veterans of the Afrika Korps, once proud mechanics and officers, now grey-haired grandfathers, standing before the machine that had humbled them 25 years earlier. One reached out, tracing his fingers across the metal hood. "I captured one of these in '42, he said softly. "Used it for 3 months before I was wounded at El Alamein. Best vehicle I ever drove." Another nodded. "Ours were more refined, but this one survived everything." They stood in silence. The war was long over, but the lesson the Jeep had taught them had never faded. They had once believed that perfection was the pinnacle of engineering. That precision, elegance, and craftsmanship were marks of superiority. But the war had taught them something else, something the Jeep had embodied from the start. Perfection doesn't win wars. Practicality does. The Jeep wasn't beautiful, it wasn't fast, it wasn't powerful, but it was right. It worked under any condition, could be fixed by anyone, and could be built by the hundreds of thousands. It was the perfect soldier's machine, unpretentious, reliable, loyal. And in its simplicity lay a truth that reshaped not only a war, but an entire nation. The German mechanics who had once mocked it went on to rebuild their country using the same philosophy. They became the architects of post-war Germany's success, the silent bridge between defeat and rebirth. They applied what they had learned in captivity: simplify, standardize, produce. The essence of American design reborn in German factories. The Volkswagen Beetle, Mercedes' new production lines, BMW's standardized engines, all carried traces of lessons first learned in desert sands and Texas motor pools. The Jeep had outlasted the empire that opposed it, and its spirit lived on not in the noise of engines, but in the quiet wisdom of men who had learned through loss. As one old mechanic said before leaving the museum that day, "We built for pride, they built for purpose, and purpose endures." The Jeep was never just a machine, it was a teacher, a reminder that strength lies not in perfection, but in the ability to endure, adapt, and begin again, and that more than any weapon, tank, or plane was how the Allies truly won. Fade out. The hum of an engine in the distance, a single Jeep driving across an empty desert, the sound of simplicity conquering complexity.